Please rewind this cassette.
By the early 90s, Steven Spielberg was already a living legend, having made and produced some of the most profitable films of all time. But in the late 80s, he had a few financial disappointments in Empire of the Sun and Always. While he did bounce back with Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the third movie in the original trilogy, he followed that up with the cult favorite but critically panned Hook. There was a question going into the 90s that put a lot of pressure on Spielberg. Would he ever win the Oscar? And would he ever reach the same heights of Jaws or E.T.? Well, in June of 1993, he released Jurassic Park, a movie that would go on to become the highest-grossing film of all time. In today's episode, we look at the monster success of Jurassic Park. This is Box Office Addict. Our story begins with writer Michael Crichton, who had been working on a screenplay with Spielberg to direct called ER. That project would never happen, but then was turned into one of the most successful shows of the 90s. Around this time, Crichton was working on Jurassic Park. Before it was even published as a novel, Crichton had demanded a non-negotiable fee of $1.5 million for the film rights and a percentage of the gross. At one point, directors Tim Burton, Richard Donner, and Joe Dante were all involved with the project. Spielberg was getting ready to make his Oscar-winning film Schindler's List, but only got it greenlit if he made Jurassic Park first. Now, this video isn't going to be a behind-the-scenes breakdown of this movie. Everybody knows the story about how it went from stop motion to CGI, the multiple actors that were up for different roles, and just how this whole thing came together. We're going to focus on the financial success of this modern classic. In 1993, the hype for this movie was as big as it gets. And this film being about a theme park and branding just played into the marketing genius behind it. From the poster to the title, being based off a best-selling novel, and people being ready for modern special effects after the groundbreaking Terminator 2. On its opening weekend, Jurassic Park grossed $47 million. At the time, this was the record for the biggest opening ever, having passed the previous record holder, Batman Returns. By the end of its first week, Jurassic Park had already grossed $81 million on a budget of $65 million. To put it simply, nothing was going to stop this movie. For a brief moment, it just took over the world. It ended its domestic run at $357 million and had a worldwide total of $912 million. This passed E.T. to become the biggest film of all time. Well, until a few years later when a little film called Titanic came out.
I'm the king of the world!
Of course, there was going to be sequels, and with each film the box office seemed to decline. Lost World made under $700 million, and Jurassic Park 3 didn't even make $400 million. It wasn't until the franchise rebooted with the Jurassic World series that this franchise finally reached new highs, with both of those movies grossing well over $1 billion. Which begs the question, how did this franchise somehow stay so relevant after all these years? Well, the first movie is so good that despite what some considered lackluster sequels, the nostalgia carried through the following decades, and Jurassic Park would continue to find new audiences every 10 years or so. Children love this franchise, and dinosaurs are as cool now as they ever were. If anything, this franchise seems to have reached a Star Wars-like level of iconic. For the first film, Spielberg brought home $250 million. This was another record at the time. After several re-releases, including one in 3D, Jurassic Park has grossed over $1 billion and remains one of the most successful films ever made. What do we take away from this? Well, if anything, I think it should be highlighted what Spielberg did here. A lot of people like to talk about James Cameron making the highest grossing film ever, and then he beat his own record when he made Avatar. This achievement seems to have overshadowed everything else in his career. He is forever known as the king of the world. Yet, if you look at Spielberg's career, in the 70s, Jaws was the highest grossing film of all time until Star Wars. Then in the 80s, E.T. became the highest grossing film of all time, and it held that record for a decade. Then in 93, Spielberg does it again, making what many consider to be the Jaws of the 90s, and the last great traditional Spielberg movie before he would transition to a new visual aesthetic and more Oscar bait type movies. Not only did he have this record in 3 different decades, in the same year that this came out, he released Schindler's List and it made over $300 million, becoming the highest grossing black and white film ever, and it went on to win 7 Academy Awards. Has anyone ever had a year this good in the history of movies? I mean, sure, you could say Cameron with Titanic, but I think this is on another level. Spielberg's entire career was building towards this moment in 93. He had learned and developed enough to have this moment in the sun. I've often considered Jurassic Park a meta blockbuster, and I see a lot of Spielberg in the character of John Hammond, a man playing God, and most stories like this would be seen as a villainous character, and he's more of that way in the book. But in the movie, he's presented as a friendly, bearded older man. He wants so badly to give people awe that he puts those he loves in danger. While Hammond brings dinosaurs back to life, so too does Spielberg and his special effects team. Now I might sound a little crazy here, but I've often felt like this movie was an apology for the Twilight Zone incident in which Vic Morrow and 2 children were killed by a helicopter on set. The last shot of this movie is 2 kids flying safely away from danger in a helicopter. There's something thematically rich and moral about this movie, and the scientists being optimistic about human life. They take this whole thing very seriously, and I think Spielberg does too. For all of its spectacle and groundbreaking visuals, this is just a well-crafted and well-told story with interesting ideas and characters. Ian Malcolm seems to have become more iconic as the years have gone by. The success of Jurassic Park just has so many elements to it, and a single video really can't do it any justice. So why even make this? Well, because I'm so nostalgic for this time. Not only was this one of the first movies I ever saw in the theater, it's one of the first movies that got me into being a nerd for box office statistics. I've been fascinated by the performance and lasting power of this movie for my entire life. A lot of the time we can easily become cynical towards films like these. But this is one of those rare exceptions where this movie being so popular and successful feels justified and like a good thing for our culture. It got children more interested in science, it helped push special effects to a new level that continues today, and above all else, it brought back the monster movie in a way that I think has only ever been done by the original King Kong and Godzilla. Before COVID-19, it started to feel like every other movie was grossing over $1 billion. I think there was one year that there was like 15 movies that made over $1 billion, and most of them were made by Disney. But when this movie came close to it in '93, it showed the potential of where movies were going internationally. It's estimated that it sold over 86 million tickets in its original run. While I still enjoy looking at the box office, I don't think it'll ever be as fun as it was for those during that time. So I look back on this with nothing but wonder, and I praise the studio for an almost perfect release that set things up for this major event. We should never forget Crichton in all of this, who basically already told the story with Westworld. His original idea of a theme park turning against you is genius in its simplicity. The movie itself turns into a theme park ride-like experience. And while it's been copied many times over, I don't think anything has ever touched it on that level of energy and scale. It's a one-of-a-kind thing. Jurassic Park is the box office highlight of the most successful director of all time.